Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Raymond Hames. He's Professor of Anthropology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His research interests are in behavioral ecology, food and labor exchange, human ecology, marriage, kin and parental investment, and other topics. And today we're going to talk about a few of them. So, Dr. Hames, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So, the first topic I would like to get into is about male hunting. So, do we know why males hunt?
Well, a couple of reasons. One is if you look at, for example, some good studies done by Hill and Hurtado on the Aceh, the rate of return, caloric rate of return for hunting is greater than gathering. Also, protein is a highly desired animal protein, that is, food nutrient. And so hunting is the, obviously the best way to get it. This is not to say that men don't gather. They do. The Hadza, for example, gather a tremendous amount of honey. And also occasionally women make opportunistic kills of game animals. So it's essentially a means to invest in their families, their wives, and their children.
Mm-hmm.
It's also, as you note, a source of high status. That is, good hunters have greater prestige than poor hunters, and one of the reasons for it is that there's a strong tendency to share food resources outside of the hunter's nuclear family.
And I mean, are there particular kinds of issues in male sociality that we can get a better understanding of by studying hunting?
A better understanding? Well, there's a view by some that men do it to essentially increase their mating efforts. They become more attractive. And this is true. That's part of the answer, but that's not the main answer. The primary goal is to essentially invest in their own families and also gain high status and prestige within the group such that they're viewed as valuable members of the group. And if problems befall them or their family, others are more likely to assist.
Mm-hmm. And talking about hunters and gatherers, of course, I know that sometimes you like to tackle some misconceptions that people have about hunter-gatherer and other kinds of traditional societies. So, are hunting peoples conservationists?
The evidence suggests that they're not. But let's put it in a larger context. We might want to ask maybe a more productive question, and that is, under what conditions are we likely to see conservation developing or evolving in a situation? Mm-hmm. And in a couple of papers, I noted that there are a number of different factors. One is the ability to be territorial. That is, that prevents people on the outside from upsetting your conservation plans. That is, if they see that you are maintaining a rich environment, they might want to go into your area. And so that's number one. Number two would be strong internal rules about, breaking conservation procedures. And the third one, and excuse me, back to number two, this is easily done in a small scale society because people see you coming in with game, and then they could note that, for example, you're taking an animal that has been tabooed for a season or something of that. The third issue I think is really interesting, and that is subsistence has to be focused on the local group, not supplying game, feathers, leather, hides to outside groups. And this is what happened to a lot of native peoples. European colonists came in and they began to encourage them to trade in animals that they used to use for subsistence, which is a kind of self-limiting, but they're essentially working for a global market, which is, the demand is always there. And so what you see is that indigenous systems are essentially destroyed by external demands. Now, at the same time, if you have low demand and relatively weak technology, then it's hard to destroy the environment, to overhunt, to overfish, et cetera. So I would say that the important factor is this external demand. But let me change the question a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
It appears that there are well-developed indigenous conservation systems in Pacific fishing communities, where we have chiefly control, where we have territoriality, et cetera, et cetera. And the work of Johannes, which I wish I had discovered earlier on, was really enlightening because he essentially noted those sorts of factors I emphasized as necessary for the development of conservation. And so I would say that if we're talking about fishing people, and these are a little bit larger scale societies because they're chiefdoms, where a chief can essentially regulate production and taboo onshore, offshore, reef fishing, coastal turtle egg collections, et cetera, then we see conservation systems developing, in non-Western small-scale societies.
Mm-hmm. So, in your work, you've also done some work on mating systems in human societies, like monogamy, polygyny, polyandry. So, what would you say are the main costs and benefits of monogamy and polygyny for women specifically?
Well, I think probably, it really depends on who they're married to. For example, there was a well-received piece by Henrik Boyd and Richardson about the negative consequences of polygyny for women. And there was a response to that by Lawson and Berghoff Mulder looking at Tanzania. And they suggested that what was going on there in terms of the negative consequences they managed to document was that polygyny tended to occur among nations that were less economically developed. And so the standard of living is low, corresponding with the presence of polygyny because they were more traditional. They looked at their North Tanzanian data and showed that within villages, women who were polygynous actually were no different or a little bit better off in terms of their child survivorship, food security, and things of that nature. And so polygyny has gotten a bad rap, but I think what it boils down to more than anything else is female choice. That is them believing that a wealthy male is going to give them a better reproductive and marital life. And to some extent, this relates to some of the cross-cultural research done by Adrian Jajegi and Chris Van Ruden, who showed that males with high status have higher reproductive success than males that have low status. Of course, one would want to wonder, how does that work out on a per capita female basis? That is, do the women in those marriages have higher fitness or survivorship of their children compared to other women? So I think, that's, and I also did some research on the Yanomamo in terms of the costs and benefits of polygyny for Yanomamo women. And it turned out that their husbands didn't work any harder than monogamous men. But if you looked at food transfers women who were married polygynously got more food from other families than monogamous women. And it's kind of a curious situation in that I calculated a measure of subsidy for the Yanomamo, and it turns out that 36% of the food they consume was produced by other families. And so you see this incredible intensity of sharing going on. I wish that people would kind of try to use that measure of subsidy to see how much of what a family consumes is given to them, usually through reciprocal altruism by other families. And I think it's a real mechanism of food security in these societies because there's such variations in daily income for food, because sometimes your garden for a couple of weeks is not producing a lot, so you can utilize the resources of other people to get you through that tough period.
And I would also like to ask you about polyandry, because at least if we look at it through an evolutionary perspective, it might seem a bit of a puzzle, particularly because of the issue of paternity uncertainty for males. But first of all, what characterizes polyandrous societies in terms of demographics, in terms of social, marital, and economic characteristics?
Well, we don't have a good handle on it, actually. In our survey, we found out that polyandry, the non-classical forms, tends to occur in small-scale societies and is rare in more large-scale societies. But if you look at the classical polyandry that we find in Tibet, here we, have a situation where we've got really intensive agriculture, pastoralism, state-level societies, et cetera, et cetera. There, I think the answer for that kind of polyandry differs in comparison to the kind of polyandry found in small-scale societies. There, it looks like a way to prevent the reduction of farm sizes, because farms can only be given to one brother. And if you keep reducing and reducing with every generation, like in Europe, then you have a problem. Now, the European solution was to essentially send people to monasteries, send them off to become soldiers, and so you could prevent this problem of land holdings become smaller and smaller such that they can't really support a family. And I think that occurs also in Tibet because they have Buddhist monasteries and other ways of kind of getting rid of, if you will, excess males. Now, back to the kind of small-scale polyandry, I think that Beckerman and his colleagues got it right in that it's a way to make sure that a child has continuous parental investment by essentially having them believe that through partible paternity, that's the kind of model that Beckerman uses, that they may be the father of that child. And so there would be a motivation for them to invest should the primary father die. So I think, polyandry can be a solution to several different problems, if you will.
And looking across all the human societies that we've studied to date, is polyandry really rare or not?
I would say that that's fair. It is rare. The standard cross-cultural sample of 186 pre-industrial societies shows that it exists in only 1%. Our recalculation shows that it actually exists in 5%. Well, that's not much of a jump, but it's still 5 times more than what we thought. And the reason for the calculation being so low in the standard cross-cultural sample is because it was measured as the ideal form of marriage, monogamy, polygyny, or monogamy only. Well, people have variation, and there's tolerance for polyandry in a variety of different societies, and so they have a freedom to kind of go against the grain, if you will. So our focus was on not whether it was socially approved, but whether it existed or did not exist.
So before we move on to another topic, just to finish this part on mating systems in human societies. So about consensual non-monogamy or having extramarital partners, do we know if it is common across human societies?
Well, there's some evidence, a great study, Brooks Glazer on the Himba in Namibia shows that occurs. And then also, if you look at Thomas Greger's work on the Mehinaku, he went into the village and they said, how many lovers does this woman have? How many lovers does this man have? Everybody knew. And so you have this situation of consensual non-monogamy. It seems to be uncommon. And again, the question we want to ask is, under what conditions are we likely to see it? And I really don't have a view on what those conditions might be, except for if you look at the Himba, there's a high level of male absenteeism. They're out herding their cattle in this very dry environment. And so females have more choice about who they might want to have as their husbands and produced offspring. But at this point, and in the modern context, I'm not sure what's going on, except that it may be, well, I can't speculate too much on that.
That's fair, that's fair. So moving on to another topic, I would like to ask you about your views on human warfare, because this is a big topic of debate among anthropologists. There are those who are sometimes called the deep rooters, who say that human warfare is ancient, it's been with us for a long while, and sometimes they say that it's basically part of human nature. And then we have also the shallow rooters who argue more or less the opposite and say that it's much more recent, that in prehistory it was not very common at all. And so there are other factors playing a role here. So what is your reading of the literature? So do you think that by looking at the literature we can say that it's been common in our evolutionary history or not?
Well, the issue is, what do you mean by common?
Okay.
What do you mean by rare? We do have some statistical information, and that has been steadily accumulating from the work of first Bruce Noft in Current Anthropology in the late 80s, then later Lawrence Keeley, and the database has been building. And what we know is that I would say that, it does have ancient roots. It's very deep. But if you look at hunter-gatherers, the frequency of warfare in terms of mortality rates is lower than what we find in horticultural societies, like I study the Yanomamo. And then it declines again, as we move into more complex societies. So it's always been present, I would say, that it varies across social and economic formations. And if you look at, there's a couple of ways to measure it. One is mortality rates, the probability of you being killed violently by someone outside of your group. And that's the pattern and then if you look at Carol Ember's research about the frequency of warfare, irrespective of mortality, hunter-gatherers have, very often have high rates of or frequencies of warfare, even though some of it, as the mortality data shows, will not amount to much. And so I think also, and this is something else I think you asked me about, kind of peaceableness among hunter-gatherers. And they've got a number of rich mechanisms for that. First is intermarriage. The second is trade. The third is intergroup visiting. What I found out in my field work that I thought was really interesting was that a lot of times, for example, elderly Yanomamo couple would go to a village where their daughter had married into just to have a vacation, to see how they were doing, to help out. And the daughter would sometimes come back home to see mom and dad. And so we see this kind of mechanism for establishing ties between villages. And then celebration of common rituals is another sort of thing that brings them together, suggests they have a common identity. And then we have numerous examples where, for example, this is from George Silberbauer's work on the Gui Bushmen, that if one group is experiencing low levels of water or food, they ask if they can be hosted by another group, and oftentimes that is allowed. And so if you look at hunter-gatherer society, I think the major misconception is to think of them as separate bands of 25 to 40 people having an independent existence, when in fact they're what Bernard Chappé refers to as a multi-level society. And there's all sorts of interaction going on between different bands, and a lot of it has to do with surviving in that kind of environment. They have an enormous amount of flexibility. This is not to say they don't fight, because they do. But if you look at the kinds of, in my opinion, if you have different ethno-linguistic groups, other groups that don't speak a common nation on the borders, it's that sort of interaction is not very common, and it doesn't promote peaceableness.
So you mentioned some of what I'm about to ask you in your answer, but where do you think the disagreement here between the so-called deep rooters and the shallow rooters really stems from? And what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that perhaps one side or the other might have on this issue?
Well, the people like I'll name names to be clear, to be candid, like Douglas Fry or R. Brian Ferguson, argue that warfare is a relatively recent phenomena, and that it has to do with the development of the state and empires. And also, they're very much against evolutionary perspectives on warfare, and essentially they want to suggest that, in my opinion, that it's a relatively recent phenomenon. It's not part of our nature. It's a consequence of the development of really large imperialistic colonizing kinds of societies. But from an evolutionary perspective, we kind of, and this is kind of based on the work of Richard Rayam, we're great cooperators, and this has negative and positive consequences. That is, we're really able and willing to help people familiar to us who are our allies, but we have this problem in that we have resource competition. That the environment becomes saturated with humans. And as a consequence, there's competition over scarce resources. And for example, if you look at the name of the Wyoming archaeologist whose name can't think of, but who wrote a great textbook on foraging societies, the foraging spectrum, shows that the frequency of warfare increases as population density increases and stress on local resources. So a lot of the fighting has to do with basically competition. And of course, this is really well illustrated, not in hunter-gatherer society, but in New Guinea, where the population densities are 200 to 400 people per square mile. And if you read someone like Mervyn Megwit, Blood is Their Argument, it's all over land. So I would think that from an evolutionary perspective, warfare is always a potential. It doesn't always occur, but what we want to do is to essentially understand the factors that trigger it, that amplify it, or will decelerate it, and make now. And to answer the other part, your question is that there's a belief by I think people like Fry and Ferguson that if we say it's human nature, it can't be eradicated. But that's false. Humans can be very cooperative and peaceful, and they can be very bloodthirsty. And it all has to do with the conditions that they face and the kinds of costs and benefits they estimate that will determine whether they'll engage in warfare or not. So I think those people have an odd understanding of evolutionary theory. We don't blindly behave. We assess the costs and the benefits. And there are considerable costs to warfare. And that can really inhibit, warfare.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I also have a question here from Dr. Luke Glowacki, because when I mentioned that I would be having you on the show, he really wanted to have a question asked. So he says, I would be interested to know about Dr. Hames's how he feels about Chagnon's argument that Unokai, and this is a term that I think the Yanomami apply
Right.
to certain males in their society, had more wives and children than others. So what do you feel about Chagnon's argument?
Okay, well, let me preface this by saying that Luke is coming out with a really useful article in the Brain and Behavioral Sciences on the evolution of peace, or the difficulties of peace. I made a comment on it, and when it comes out, you ought to read it before you interview Luke. The data that Chagnon's presented is problematic. I don't think it was properly analyzed statistically. He, for example, only included living Unokais, and an Unokai is a person who's gone through a ceremony because they've killed an enemy. And so it's a recognition of your quality as a warrior, someone who's paid his dues. And so that's one problem. Another problem is what about the Unokais who no longer live? And so I think he's correct in what he's trying to say, but statistically, I think there are some problems in the data that call for reanalysis.
Okay. So moving on to another topic then, you've also studied or done a bit of work on male homosexuality and male androphilia. And I know that as an anthropologist, you establish a difference there between male homosexuality or male same-sex behavior and male androphilia. So could you tell us first about that distinction and why it is important?
Well, male androphilia is a orientation by males to other males as sexual partners. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they not interested in females; they're interested in other males, and so that's their sexual orientation. Homosexuality would be any kind of same-sex interaction. This could occur in prison, where males have no outlet, so they make the best of a bad situation, or it can occur, for example, in New Guinea, the famous cases where young boys are required to fillet the older males, even though they don't want to. So that's technically homosexual behavior. But so that's the difference, whether it's a desire for a partner, or you're coerced, like in prison, or as a young boy, or maybe you're in prison and you have got no other sexual outlets, so this is making the best of a bad situation. So that's how I would distinguish. And that's fairly standard kind of way to, earlier research on, anthropological research on male homosexuality didn't make that kind of distinction. More modern research and the best research on the topic from an anthropological perspective is by Paul Vasey in his research on the Fafines in Samoa and the Mushes in Mexico.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, when it comes to understanding this sort of phenomena, when it comes to human sexuality, why is it important to establish this distinction between male same-sex behavior and male androphilia?
Well, the interesting thing is that if you look at the data in large-scale societies, you find that it exists at a low rate of 2 to 3% of all males exhibit male androphilia. If you look at the data in tribal societies, you find that maybe, as we found, only about 50-60% practice male androphilia. Why is it important? Because it simply shows variation in male sexual behavior, but also it's a really curious evolutionary problem. How can a trait that leads to zero fitness become so common, even at low levels, in a huge level of societies? That is a real mystery, because that trait should be extinguished, because their fitness is essentially zero or nearly zero. In the past, males could hide it, they could have regular families and then do it on the side, but overall, you would expect, so that's a real interesting evolutionary question. And so that's why it's studied, I think.
And from an evolutionary perspective, in this case, as an evolutionary anthropologist, do you think that we already have an answer to that or not?
Well, the only answer I can think of is Ray Blanchard's research on fraternal birth order. That is, for example, the probability of a male becoming androphilic increases as he is lower on the birth order. So you get the stepwise increase if you're second born, if you're third born, if you're fourth born, then the probability keeps getting higher and higher and higher. And he has an idea about maternal immune response and kind of changing the hormonal makeup in the womb to ultimately lead to males becoming more male androphilic. And his data has been realized, or the model's been realized in a number of different studies. And so that's the kind of proximate mechanism that leads to it. And so it could be, we see it as an unavoidable side effect of birth order, and that's why it is not extinguished. But I put some money on that bet, but I'm not totally convinced. But I think that's one of the best answers we have right now.
Mm-hmm. But looking across human societies, can we say that male androphilia is a human universal?
Well, that's what we wrote. So I think so. I think that if it's not actively argued against or put down or prohibited, then I think it emerges. And it may not be very, for example, there was a fine study done by an old friend, Barry Hewlett, on Aka sexuality. And when he asked about same-sex behavior, androphilia, they didn't know what he was talking about. They had no idea what the mechanics would be. And it was like, what are you talking about? We've never heard of this before. And he and his wife, had really good rapport with the Aka, so that they would, be revealing about the details of their sexual life. And, if you think about a small scale society, and it exists in, let's say, 2%, the probability of those people meeting up and being attracted to one another and wanting to realize the attraction through their sexuality is probably pretty low. You just don't, you have to have a certain core. So, for example, in large scale societies, they can segregate in a part of the city, where they find plenty of partners. But in a small scale society, that may not be possible at all. So it may be a scale problem.
Mm-hmm. So getting into the last topic of our conversation today, and I guess that this also connects in a way to one of the topics we covered earlier when we talked about some of the debate between the deep rooters and the shallow rooters when it comes to human warfare and peace systems. So there seems to be a divide in anthropology between the evolutionary and the sociocultural subfields. So how do you look at that divide, and where do you think it stems from?
Well, I would think, the part of the divide has a difference between a humanistic approach and a scientific approach. And both approaches have a long, legitimate history in anthropology. Mm-hmm. And, to use kind of Marvin Harris's distinction, the humanistic is more of an emic approach. What it's like to be a member of a certain culture, the belief systems they have, is very kind of nuanced, is very qualitative, is based on small sample sizes, et cetera, et cetera. And so the focus is on agency, how people react to their own culture, the degree to which they adhere to their cultural rules, but in a kind of very personal way. Whereas the scientific approach is more behaviorally oriented, and it has to do with more what people do, their actions, and things of that nature, insofar as we can measure them. So there is this divide. I think the divide is fine. Both sides can benefit, I think, from each other's perspectives. But then at the same time, there's another element in the more qualitative aspect of anthropology that is postmodern, regards science as an enemy, regards science as oppressive, and so there's that kind of movement in anthropology that is causing a great deal of friction. For example, I relinquished my membership in the American Anthropological Association about 10 years ago because, one, I didn't like the politics that were going on, but two, it was that I would go to the conference and I could hardly see anything that was of relevance to the kind of research that I was interested in. It's like the Bruce Springsteen song, 57 channels and nothing on. And so I would go to other conferences where my interests were, because it's expensive to go to a conference and you better be able to see lots of things that you really want to see. And I didn't get that out of the AAA. And then also the AAA has become much more political.
Mm-hmm. So I imagine that you also think that, for example, some of the criticisms that people put forth against evolutionary anthropology, for example, like some of the ones that have to do with associating it with reactionary political views and thinking that the evolutionists do not take into account things like culture and agency. I imagine that you also do not agree with those criticisms. Right.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. First of all, uh, uh, Pete Richardson and Rob Boyd and Joe Heinrichs really focus on the cultural dimensions of anthropology, and they're evolutionary at the same time. So there's no fundamental incompatibility. But let me address the argument about being reactionary. There have been two studies done, one by Lyles and Smith on anthropologists, and the other one by Tiber and Steve Gangstead Steve's at New Mexico. And they did a kind of questionnaire about political beliefs and attitudes, et cetera, et cetera. And it turns out that evolutionary anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists are your typical liberal, progressive kinds of people, just like they're no different than the non-evolutionary social scientists, either in anthropology or in psychology. So I think this criticism is absolutely wrong and is not borne out by in terms of the beliefs that evolutionary-minded social scientists have towards social issues, whether they be things such as affirmative action, gay rights, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, greater involvement in government policies to alleviate poverty, and et cetera, et cetera. So they're just ordinary psychologists and anthropologists in terms of their viewpoints.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, just before I ask you my last question, just to add a follow-up to that, I mean, where do you think these criticisms stem from? If looking at the data, they do not seem to correspond to anything real, why do you think that people come up with those criticisms?
Well, that's a fair question because it's not coming out of the thin air. And one I would think is that they have a poor understanding of how evolution works and evolutionary theory and how animals are not robots. They take into consideration costs and benefits. Things are contingent. Also, the early work of E.O. Wilson, for example, made a series of statements about hunter-gatherers that are completely false. And then also there's the legacy of Conrad Lorenz and other early human ethologists who talked about fixed action patterns and instincts in a very kind of unsophisticated way. But give them a break. It's early on trying to understand animal behavior, and then maybe rushing to understand human behavior. And so I think many of the critics essentially have a really poor understanding of the complexity of evolutionary thinking. And I think, and then of course, there's the herd effect in that you do some virtue signaling if you condemn an evolutionary point of view. And you're cheered on. And so part of it is, may I say, tribal in orientation, because anthropologists can be just as tribal as Democrats and Republicans or socialists and nationalists, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, it's largely ignorance. And it's also I would say, could I say, anti-science in general, part of it, from the postmodern crew, and the belief that, science is colonialistic, misogynistic, et cetera, because it's done by white males, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's my view.
Fair enough. So, one last question then, because I haven't asked you yet about human behavioral ecology. I would like to hear your thoughts about what you think is the role of ecology in human behavior and in explaining differences across societies, and also how you look at the relationship between evolutionary anthropology and human behavioral ecology.
You mean evolutionary psychology and behavioral ecology, the distinctions between those two fields? Uh, well, behavioral ecology is more concerned with the development of measures that are either fitness, like Chagnon's Unokai study, or proxies to fitness, like disease avoidance or rate of return, et cetera, et cetera. So they're uh, trying to develop ways of testing optimization models in terms of how people um, behave. Evolutionary psychology, on the other hand, has a bit of an interest in that, but more to the kinds of psychological mechanisms that humans have that lead them to behave in ways that are studied by um, behavioral ecologists. And there is, uh, a great deal of overlap in what we do. But the evolutionary psychologists are more interested in mental modules, whereas we do what's known as the phenotypic gambit, a term developed by Grafin, as you know. And in terms of using for example, if you look at optimal foraging theory, it's a good example. Diet breath model. Here's how you should allocate your time. Here's how you should rank animals and maximize your rate of return. And so very behaviorally and quantitatively oriented. But I would say that by and large, evolutionary ecologists appreciate the work of behavioral ecologists, and behavioral ecologists, to a lesser extent, I would say a little bit perhaps, appreciate the word evolutionary psychology. And I have a colleague that I published a couple things with, Ed Hagen, who's a dyed-in-the-wool evolutionary psychologist, student of Tooby, and I don't know if I should name names, but anyway, uh, he does both. I think it would be like a division of labor, in that we're more in the area of what a naturalist is. We observe society as it's going on, where they're more lab oriented, and both kinds of work are important.
Great. So, Dr. Hames, just before we go, would you like to mention any places on the internet where people can find you and your work?
Oh, I sometimes post on Twitter, but I'm fairly easy to find on the internet. I don't have a blog page or anything of that nature, but I surface now and again on Twitter, making, for example, there's a recent paper on female hunting that appeared, and I made a comment there. No one ever said that men exclusively hunt and women exclusively gather, but I'm very interested in hunter-gatherer research on warfare, and you'll see me pop up, but not systematically.
Great. So, Dr. Hames, thank you again so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and your astute questions.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please do not forget to like it, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like more generally what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You have all of the links in the description of this interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Per Erga Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreff, Francis Ford, Tiago Dunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Weira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hallman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eikeland, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Olsen, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Holt Ericbun, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Gressis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Manuel Oliveira, Kimberly Johnson, and Benjamin Galbart. A special thanks to my producers, Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Alnick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.